Well, hey, you guys, welcome back to the salon again. Long time no see. So, as you can see, we're returning to our long running Night Gallery breakdown where we kind of break down each of the episodes. So, we've now arrived at season 2, episode 15. Now, this was another installment that had 3 stories, 2 of which are pretty decent, and one of which is kind of not decent. Let's put it that way. So the first story is called Green Fingers, and it was directed by John Badham, not really sure how you pronounce his last name, even though he's been around forever. He would actually go on to direct, after this, obviously, he went on to direct Saturday Night Fever, there you go, Dracula, the Frank Langella one, War Games, and also Short Circuit, among many other things. So Green Fingers was based on a short story by R.C. Cook, and the teleplay was written by Rod Serling himself. Also stars the Bride of Frankenstein, Elsa Lanchester, as well as Cameron Mitchell, who was in a bunch of movies on Mystery Science Theater, if you didn't know who that was. And he's kind of doing this really over-the-top Southern accent. I guess it's supposed to be a Southern accent, but I'm not entirely sure. So this story is pretty straightforward, gonna say. Within the first few minutes, you can pretty much tell exactly, how it's gonna go. Not exactly, but you'll get in the right ballpark. So Elsa Lanchester plays Mrs. Bowen, who is this kind of dotty old widow, and she's living quite happily in this cottage in the middle of nowhere and tending to her garden, which is her big thing. Now, Michael Saunders, played by Cameron Mitchell, is your stereotypical cigar-chomping, real estate mogul, asshole type guy who wants to buy Mrs. Bowen's land as part of a big, parcel that he's buying around there that he's going to put this big-ass factory on. So this old lady has lived on this property her whole life and has absolutely no intention of selling it, no matter how much cash they wave in front of her. They never tell you how much it is specifically, but it's apparently a pretty substantial sum. Now, Saunders actually tries to bully her into, giving him his way. She first just kind of blows him off and just starts regaling him with all the amazing things that she grows in her garden. And significantly, she says, she has the titular green fingers and can grow absolutely anything. Remember that for later. Then basically tells him to get lost because no amount of money is going to make her change her mind. So, by the way, I actually did laugh out loud at a line that Cameron Mitchell had in here. I can't remember what it was exactly, but the gist of it was when she was saying I planted a stick one time and a tree grew from it or something like that. And he's like, I don't care if you can plant a gas can and grow a filling station, you know what I mean? And for some reason, the imagery of that just really cracked me up. I mean, your mileage may vary, I guess. So now and I know that an evil land developer like our boy here is absolutely not above having an old woman whacked if she's standing in his way. Because as soon as that whole thing happened where she just gave him the brush off, I was like, he's going to have her killed, isn't he? I'm sure that's the next move. And indeed, in the very next scene, Saunders is standing outside Mrs. Bowen's house that evening, giving sort of cryptic wink-wink sort of instructions to what we presume is a hitman named Crowley. Why they are planning a murder for hire while literally standing on the property of their intended victim is a mystery for the ages. So Saunders never says outright that Crowley should kill the old woman, but he's also not saying that. You know what I mean? It's that kind of situation. So after this discussion, there's a very abrupt cut to police cars speeding toward her house with some exposition that a neighbor heard a woman screaming. And so you're led to assume that the worst has happened and Mrs. Bowen is no longer among the living. I mean, you'd be led to assume that if you've never seen a horror story before, because this is going to go a different direction. So the cops go into the house and they find evidence of a disturbance, shit is, knocked over and stuff. And there is also a bloody axe in the house. But to their surprise, Mrs. Bowen is still alive. Now, she's kind of traumatized and is sort of babbling in a way that doesn't really make a lot of sense. And she's burying something that we don't see, in the garden behind her house. We're also informed that the perpetrator, presumably Crowley, ran into a wall somewhere while fleeing police. I don't remember if they said he ran into a wall, like literally he was running on foot and ran into a wall. I'm like, that's kind of hard to do. Or if he ran into a wall with his car, which makes a little bit more sense. I don't think they specified. So he actually died at the scene. And I'm also not sure how they knew that Crowley was the suspect before they even got to Mrs. Bowen's house. But, whatever. So it transpires that Crowley had actually roughed up Mrs. Bowen and chopped one of her fingers off with the axe, hence all the blood. Now, despite this fairly survivable injury, she actually dies later in the hospital, with the doctor saying that it's probably old age and shock and blood loss, and we see it happen sometimes. That's probably what did her in. Now, later on, we see Michael Sanders out at the old lady's cottage, kind of gloating over this little scrap of land that's now going to be part of his big planned factory empire. But not so fast. Remember how I said that Mrs. Bowen was burying something in the garden when the police got there, and that Crowley had chopped her finger off? You can probably guess what happens next. Another version of Mrs. Bowen, I'm presuming, crawls out of the dirt where the finger was buried. And when Saunders goes inside the house, he sees this old woman sitting kind of creepily in her rocking chair, partially covered in vines, and telling him how she can grow anything in her garden, even me. And then after this, that would have actually been a good place to end it. But after this, there's a very bizarre scene that goes on way too long, in which Cameron Mitchell seems to lose his mind at what he witnessed. I guess because they had to have him get punished, but maybe they didn't want to make it him get killed, so it's just he went crazy or something, so he can't take advantage of the shit that he did. He starts talking real crazily and directly to the audience, right into the camera, for what seems like several minutes, and it's kind of strange. I feel like it would have been a lot cooler if Mrs. Bowen would have just grown back as Audrey 2 and just straight up eaten the dude or something like that. But, as it was, we just have to be content with Cameron Mitchell kind of mugging and acting insane in this weird close-up before the whole thing cuts to black. It's, like I said, it's kind of bizarre. I mean, this was an okay story. I mean, like I said, it didn't have any surprises at all. If you've ever seen any kind of horror story, you know how it's going to go. And the ending was pretty lame. Like I said, I think it would have been a lot more impactful if they'd have just ended it when he sees her sitting there creepy in the rocking chair, but they didn't really do that, and it was just, I don't know, it was just a very strange ending. I mean, Elsa Lanchester was really fun in this, and the scene with her in the rocking chair was actually kind of a little bit unnerving, but other than that, this was just kind of a passable story, you know what I mean? Now, the second story, which is called The Funeral, was directed by John Meredith Lucas, and it's one of those kind of comic relief installments that I've never been a fan of. I think I've discussed this on several of my other breakdowns of Night Gallery episodes. What makes this one especially cringeworthy is that the teleplay was written by horror legend Richard Matheson from his own short story. Despite this pedigree, though, it's painfully dumb. Which makes me really, really sad to say because, as I'm sure I've mentioned a time or 12 or 30,000, I am a huge Richard Matheson fan. So in this story, we have this sort of obsequious funeral home director named Silkline, and he kind of presides over this fancy schmancy establishment with the admittedly hilarious name of Silkline's Cut Rate Catafalque. Is that how you pronounce that? I see that word in print all the time, but I've never heard anybody say it out loud. So I'm actually not sure how you pronounce it. So there's another dude named Asper, who's actually played by Werner Klemperer, who's probably best known to old people as Colonel Klink from Hogan's Heroes. So he's in this. Now he shows up and he wants to plan a funeral. He asks for the best of everything, and money is no object. So there's a bit of a back and forth, and then Silkline asks who the funeral is for. Asper says it's for him. And even though you'd think that funeral directors wouldn't be totally unfamiliar with somebody planning their own funeral, what if somebody had a terminal illness or something like that, Silkline acts kind of like it's the weirdest request in the world. Now, as even Amoeba have probably guessed by now, Asper is in fact not terminally ill, but is actually a vampire. And he's kind of bummed out because he never got to have a big funeral with all his friends in attendance, so he's kind of throwing around some cash to get this big epic party that he always kind of felt he was denied over his centuries of existence, you know what I mean? So Silkline's kind of reluctant about the whole thing. Asper kind of flashes his fangs at him to get the old man to comply with his wishes. He's like, look, I'm going to pay you a lot of money. Like, quit giving me static about it. Then he turns into a bat and flies out the window, as one does. Now, at this point, I thought the story was over. And I kind of wish it had been, because while it was kind of stupid, it wouldn't, it just kept going. You know what I mean? I feel like a lot of the Night Gallery episodes, like the stories that are the funny ones, are kind of just funny, stupid little vignettes like this. So I kind of thought that was the end. But tragically, no. As I said, it keeps on going. So the day of Asper's funeral arrives, and Asper shows up kind of early to check everything out, and he's really pleased. Everything's exactly to his specifications, and it looks all beautiful and everything like that. So he's checking out the casket, and then his guests start to arrive. And oh boy, it's kind of like an old school like JC's haunted house from like the 1970s, like just unloaded all over the set. Like somebody brought them all in on a truck or something. There's this kind of cackling, Cockney accented witch with a massive nose and this stuffed black cat perched on her shoulder that she talks to. There's a werewolf who just kind of howls and barks at stuff. There's a kind of distinguished older blue-skinned vampire with the requisite cape and, the whole thing around his neck with the ribbon and all that kind of crap. Then there's a female vampire. I think it's a vampire, I guess. It's kind of basically looks like Lily Munster. Then there's like a Peter Lorre sounding like Igor guy. It's like every cheeseball Halloween cliche came clambering out of some low rent costume shop and decided to do some bad community theater. It was just kind of like that level, you know what I mean? I felt such contact embarrassment for everyone involved that I almost fast forwarded through the section, not gonna lie to you. Now, as much as the older vampire, who was kind of the MC, I guess, of the funeral, he's trying to keep things dignified during the service as Asper is laying there very happily in his very comfortable coffin. The witch just keeps like talking smack. The werewolf starts causing all these disruptions because he has to leave soon for an appointment. And like not Igor guy like invades the personal space of the funeral director, who's kind of like looking on at the whole situation in horror and utter disbelief. So this whole shit show culminates with the very impatient werewolf jumping out the window when the service goes on too long. It was literally like 3 minutes. It's like, why did you even show up if you had an appointment elsewhere? You know what I mean? Just kind of dumb. And then like the witch burns half the place down, or so it appears, with her witchcraft when Asper tries to get her to leave for just like acting an ass. You know what I mean? Now, it actually appears as though the place mostly goes up in flames, and Silkline, I thought that he died of smoke inhalation. I mean, that seemed like what happened. He was laying there and then he went, oh, like, like somebody dies in a movie. But that wasn't really what happened, because in the next scene, the funeral parlor looks intact, like it's not burned or anything, and Silkline is like completely fine. So I don't really know what that was all about. I don't know if it was all a hallucination or magic or who fucking knows. But yeah, in fact, he gets a new potential customer coming into his office who was apparently referred by the very satisfied Asper. Only this monster, I guess, he's kind of like a kind of ghost or something, but he has like this red glowing face, and he just is like a smoke monster, basically. He's just kind of like just smoke coming off, and all this thick smoke comes off and like chokes Silkline while he's trying to write down the details, and then it all just kind of like fades to white, and I'm like, comedy. So yeah, like, where do I start with this one? Now, as I mentioned on my past breakdowns, I don't really see the point of these silly little installments like this. I mean, don't get me wrong, I'm not averse to horror comedy as a subgenre, but it would help if the shit was, actually funny instead of making me want to jab roofing nails in my eyes and ears. I mean, I still love Richard Matheson, obviously, but damn, I mean, he missed the whole entire flotilla of boats on this one. It's just terrible. Now, the third story is easily the best of the bunch, even though I will say the outcome is a tad murky and the narrative is slightly repetitive, but these are very, very minor complaints. So this is called The Tune in Dan's Café. It was written by Gerald Sanford and Gary Bateson from a short story by Seamus Fraser and was directed by David Rawlins. Now, we have a couple named Joe and Kelly. Joe's actually played by Pernell Roberts, and Susan Oliver plays Kelly, so you'll recognize both of those actors. They're in the middle of kind of like a marriage breakdown, I guess. They've presumably, you're led to assume, it's implied, that they've been on this long road trip to sort out their issues, but they sort of show up at this very lonely cafe in the middle of nowhere one night, and it's pretty clear that they haven't talked to one another like hardly at all during this whole entire 400 mile journey, and are kind of pretty much heading for divorce. So they go into the cafe, and even though the door is unlocked and the open sign is on, the place looks completely and utterly deserted. Most of the lights are out. Inside, there's no customers, there's no employees, there's nobody. Now, in spite of this, I mean, you would think if you just walked in, you'd be like, oh, it must be closed and they forgot to lock the door, and you would just leave. But no, they just they just go in there and slide into a booth. So Kelly starts looking at a menu, and then Joe is kind of desperately trying to talk to her, but she's really not giving him any answers. So Joe gets kind of frustrated with all of this awkward silence, and he moseys over to the jukebox, which is against the opposite wall, and he's kind of like surprised because he's like, oh, it has this kind of somewhat obscure song that was playing when he and Kelly first met. So he puts some money into the jukebox and kind of saunters back to the table, kind of hoping, I guess, that the song will conjure up some pleasant memories, like remind them of happier times or whatever. But to his consternation, a different song starts to play. It's kind of a sad, country-ish kind of sounding song. So Joe figures, oh, maybe he just pushed the wrong button, or the records in the jukebox aren't in there in the right order, or something like that. Like, no biggie. Now, finally, the proprietor of the place emerges, likely the titular Dan, since it's called Dan's Café. So he apologizes, said, oh, man, I was out back, and, not many people come in here, so I was out back cleaning or something like that, and I didn't hear you guys. So they order, and he starts making them some burgers. Now, Joe goes back over to the jukebox and tries to play the song that he wants, but it's just not happening. No matter what button he pushes, the machine always plays that same, sad country song. And not only that, but the song always starts to skip at the exact same spot, even though it seems like it's a different record playing every single time. So Joe asked Dan, what the fuck is up with your jukebox, man? You know what I mean? And Dan says, bro, I know you're probably not going to believe me, but he's like, I have replaced every record in that thing multiple times, and I even replaced the whole ass jukebox at one point. But it still does the same thing. That is the only fucking song it will play. Now, he doesn't come out and say that he believes that the phenomenon is supernatural, but it's pretty obvious that he thinks that. So he then explains that this particular song was the song of a couple that used to frequent the place, whose names were Roy and Red. Now, we as the audience already know that something bad likely happened to them, because all during the story, we've been seeing kind of brief flashes of a couple in a bar and quick shots of the glass breaking on the front of the jukebox, which causes the record to skip at the place that it always skips. And then Dan says something about a deal gone bad, and then he kind of speculates what would happen if Red ever came back, and he also implies that he's not really looking forward to that day because he thinks that will signal something bad. Now, after a bit, the jukebox starts playing the song on its own, at which point Joe and Kelly get sort of creeped out, as you would, and they decide to leave. Now, as they're getting in their car in the parking lot, another car pulls up with a man driving and a passenger who is clearly Red. Although, I was kind of taken out of the story a bit at this point. Because how would Joe, because Joe looked at her like, holy shit, that's Red, but how would he have recognized her is what I'd like to know. He'd never seen her before, and, I mean, Dan told him about her, but it's not like he can project his memories, you know what I mean, for other people to look at. The audience knows what she looks like because we've seen her in the flashbacks, but unless Dan described her in great detail, which he's actually never shown doing, then Joe wouldn't necessarily have any reason to believe that it was her, other than her also having red hair. Maybe that was the only thing. I mean, and also maybe he was just primed for it because Dan said something about her coming back, but I don't really know. Maybe I'm thinking about it too hard. So through implication and bits of dialogue, we kind of piece together that Roy and Red, I think, had stolen some money And then Red double-crossed Roy and turned his ass in to the police. And he ended up being killed in a police shootout at that very cafe where the jukebox was destroyed while that record was playing. Now, it's evidently been Roy's ghost haunting the jukebox, you presume, and waiting for his kind of faithless girlfriend to come back. So indeed, when Red and what we're led to assume is her new boyfriend enter the cafe, we just see it from outside. There's like a scream from inside, and then we cut to black. We never get to see exactly what happened to Red. It's actually left to the imagination. So as I mentioned, this was easily the best story out of the three. The acting was really good. The setup was actually really nice and kind of eerie. And although the ending left things kind of vague and didn't really show you exactly what happened, there were enough clues scattered throughout to get kind of the gist, you know what I mean? And like I said, you could just imagine like what happened, like what the ghost did to her or whatever. I don't think this story ranks among like the best stories in the series, but it was pretty damn solid. So that's a wrap for this episode. I'm eventually, like I said, going to work my way through all of these, although obviously that's going to take a while. So, you know, keep watching this space for whenever I get around to them. Hopefully you guys enjoyed this video. If you did, remember, please like, share, subscribe, and comment. And I will see you guys in the salon next time. Bye.